This is Philosophy Bites with me, David Edmonds.
And me, Nigel Warburton.
Philosophy Bites is available at www.philosophybites.com.
Philosophy Bites is made in association with the Institute of Philosophy.
Some philosophers changed the world. Peter Singer's writings helped launch the animal welfare movement, sometimes called the animal rights movement. Singer believed that we need to take animal suffering seriously, that to dismiss animal pain merely because it was animal and not human was what he called speciesism. Gary Francione of Rutgers University argues that Singer and those like him who want to improve animal welfare are utterly misguided, but not because they're too radical, quite the contrary.
Gary Francione, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're going to talk about animal abolitionism. Perhaps you could just begin by explaining what that is.
Well, a bit of history. For the past 200 years, our approach to animal ethics has been the animal welfare approach, the notion that it's all right to use animals as long as we treat them humanely. This goes back to Bentham. Bentham said, look, animals can suffer. The suffering is morally relevant, but animals aren't self-aware. They don't care that we use them. They only care about how we use them, and we need to use them in a humane way. The modern animal movement really is still stuck in that sort of paradigm. I mean, if you look at the modern animal movement, which is dominated very much by the thinking of Peter Singer and these large animal groups, no one's really challenging the use of animals. They're saying that, we need to engage in compassionate consumption, happy meat, free-range eggs, things of that nature. And that really, the difference between the classical animal welfare view and the modern animal protection position, or whatever you want to call it, is that we've got to do a better job on humane treatment, that we haven't done a very good job. We need to do it better. And the abolitionist approach that I've been developing, the primary component is that we really can't justify any animal use. And humane treatment is a fantasy. It's on an epistemological par with sort of Santa Claus, bunny rabbits, Easter rabbits, and things of that nature. It's silly. Humane treatment is impossible.
Okay, well, the welfare approach seems quite plausible to me. I mean, we know that animals have different capacities for suffering. They don't all have the same nervous systems. Higher mammals are presumably much more able to suffer in a way analogous to human beings than, say, an invertebrate. What is wrong with that approach?
There are lots of problems with the animal welfare approach. First of all, it says we shouldn't inflict unnecessary suffering. Well, what do we mean by that? We can have an interesting discussion about what necessity means, but if the principle that we ought not to inflict unnecessary suffering means anything, surely it means that we shouldn't inflict suffering for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Well, that rules out about 99.99999% of our animal use, which is transparently frivolous. I mean, when you are deciding what to eat tonight, you're not in any situation of compulsion or necessity. You're making decisions, life and death decisions, based on palate pleasure, or when you choose clothes, fashion sense, or things of that nature. As a matter of fact, the use of animals in experiments, which I object to completely, is the only use of animals that we make that is not transparently frivolous. Everything else is transparently frivolous. So therefore, if we take seriously the notion that we ought not to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals, the first thing we ought to do is all go vegan. I mean, we kill 56 billion land animals. It doesn't include, obviously, aquatic animals. 56 billion animals every year for food. Now, none of that is necessary. We're not in a situation where, it's us or them. There's something peculiar about talking about the moral status of animals when we're killing and eating them for no reason whatsoever. And so when you say, well, animals have different capacities to suffer, well, I don't know that you can really, without making lots of assumptions, lots of normative assumptions, I don't know how you can say that the ones that suffer like us matter more morally, any more than we can say that people who have lighter skin matter more than people who have darker skin because they're more like us. I mean, the fact that they suffer like us, so what?
Well, if you think of an amoeba, that to me is much closer to a plant in its terms of its capacity to feel pain and so on than a chimpanzee is.
I don't think an amoeba is sentient. By sentience, I mean perceptual awareness. It may be difficult to draw the line. I've recently been having discussions with people about mollusks. It may be difficult cases. I don't eat any mollusks because I err in favor of assuming that they're sentient. There seems to be some evidence. Now, I mean, when I walk, I try not to walk on grass so that I don't kill insects. I don't know whether insects are sentient. But I do know that fish and lobsters and pigs and cows and chickens and all of the animals we routinely exploit and all the mice and rats that are used in laboratories, they are all sentient, perceptually aware. They value their lives. They have an interest in continuing to live. They prefer, desire, or want to continue to live.
One of the common arguments in this area is that, look, human beings have language and a capacity to reflect on their own experience, and that puts them into a special moral category. What you're suggesting is that we should lump all sentient beings together.
Yes and no. I mean, I'm not saying that cognitive characteristics don't matter morally under any circumstance. I'm saying for purposes of use as a resource, they don't matter. You can have a normal human being, and then you can have a human being that has transient global amnesia, no sense of the past, no sense of the future, but a strong sense of the present right now. You can have someone who has Alzheimer's, who has no sense of the past, no sense of the future, but a strong sense of the present right now. Is that person self-aware? Yes. Does that person have an interest in continuing to live? Yes. Is that interest in continuing to live different from your interest and my interest? The answer is probably yes. Is it morally relevant? It may be. Somebody who's mentally disabled, someone who has cognitive impairment of a particular degree, you might want not to treat the same way as someone who doesn't have that impairment, in terms of you might not want to give that person a driver's license. If someone has transient global amnesia and you're looking for a history lecturer, you might not want to appoint somebody who's got transient global amnesia to be a history lecturer. But if the question is, who do we use as a forced organ donor or as a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment? The answer is you don't use either of them. So cognitive characteristics matter. They can have moral significance, but for purposes of resource use, they don't, not in my view. That's a foundational principle of the abolitionist approach.
So that is very different from a thinker like Peter Singer, who presumably would allow that we could use animals in various ways. It's just that in the process we should minimise the suffering we cause to them.
Yeah, I mean, Peter's view is really no different from that of Bentham. I mean, Peter has this view that animals don't have an interest in continuing to live. He makes exceptions for the non-human great apes and perhaps for dolphins or whatnot, but he thinks as a general matter, animals don't have an interest in continuing to live, and that they don't care that we use them. They only care about how we use them. He does not think killing them is harming them per se. It's that sort of thinking that leads to this happy meat movement, compassionate consumption movement. As a matter of fact, right before I came in for the interview, I was having a cup of tea in one of the cafeterias, and they had all these foods for sale, free range this and free range that. I wanted to have a discussion with them and say, take this stuff off the shelves. The bottom line is Britain treats animals more humanely than any other place in the world. And you know what? You still torture them, and the difference is between waterboarding somebody on a bare waterboard and waterboarding somebody on a padded waterboard. If you think that that's morally significant, I respectfully disagree.
Well, this is interesting because there's a pragmatic question here. An abolitionist is arguing that we should just get rid of using animals, and arguing for that case may not be the most effective way of bringing about a movement in that direction. So many people might say that it'd be far more effective to do this in stages, so we could look for more humane treatment of animals as a step towards a position in an ideal future where animals aren't used at all.
Look, we would agree, I assume, that child molestation is a major problem. Nevertheless, nobody would suggest that we have a campaign for humane child molestation. We think it's wrong, and we think we ought to take a position of abolition with respect to it, a zero-tolerance policy. The regulation of animal exploitation is fundamentally flawed as a practical matter. Put aside the moral issues. It can't work as a practical matter. Animals are chattel property. They have no value. You might have a dog or a cat that you value, but that's simply because that's a piece of property that we allow you. Part of what property ownership means is we allow you to value your property the way you want. So if you have an automobile and you want to take really exceptionally good care of it, we allow you to do that. If you don't want to take exceptionally good care of it, that's okay, as long as you take enough care of it so that it gets through its inspection. The same thing with animals. They're economic commodities. It costs money to protect their interests. And we generally don't protect their interests unless we get some sort of benefit, generally economic, from doing so. Now, if that thesis is correct, then if you look at animal welfare reform, what you should expect to find is that in many, if not most cases, animal welfare reform actually makes animal use more economically efficient. So if you look at things, for example, the movement away from the veal crate, that's very much an economic matter. I mean, if you take a veal calf out of the crate and put the veal calf in a small social unit, you actually decrease the veterinary costs. It really doesn't make a whole lot of difference in the grand scheme of things. And frankly, in a really rational world, these reforms would occur anyway as a result of economic rationality. In a sense, the modern animal movement involves animal groups working with industry to try to identify economically inefficient practices. But that has nothing to do with changing the status of animals as beings that have absolutely no intrinsic inherent value, they're still commodities. They're still economic commodities. The most humanely treated animals are subjected to treatment which would be torture, which we would call literally torture if humans were involved.
Imagine a world where there was no factory farming and animals were living in this free-range way but were still being slaughtered. Compare that with a world with lots of factory farming. Surely the former would be better than the latter.
Well, but that's really no different from saying, imagine a world in which children are molested, and then children are molested and also beaten. A world in which they're just molested is better than a world in which they're molested and beaten. Well, that's a no-brainer. It's always better to cause less harm than more harm, but that doesn't answer the question about whether imposing any harm is morally justifiable. And I think what you've just shown is how profound the impact has been of these large animal organizations, because what they're doing is making you think that's the question, that what we need to be doing is moving away from factory farming and toward this idyllic, it's wonderful, the animals are just lining up to be slaughtered and they're just happy animals. First of all, that's never going to happen as a practical matter. Secondly, it completely ignores the moral question. Is it better to torture less than torture more? The answer is, of course it is. Doesn't answer the question.
Now, we've been mostly talking about harm to animals, but some kinds of uses of animals might not harm them in a way that causes suffering. So I'm thinking particularly of the way some people humanely use pets. Is that something you object to as well?
Well, I think domestication is a problem. My partner and I live with 5 rescued dogs. I absolutely love dogs. You won't find anybody on the planet who likes dogs and enjoys being with them more than I do. And if there were 2 left on the planet and it were up to me as to whether or not they reproduced so that we could continue to have pets, the answer is absolutely not. As much as I love our dogs and I hope they have a good life, the bottom line is it's a really troubling life in the sense that they're completely dependent on us for everything, and they live in this netherworld. They're not really animals and they're not humans. They sort of live in this netherworld of vulnerability where they're sort of completely dependent on us. It strikes me as being, in certain ways, a sort of a sad existence, and I think we ought to take care of the ones that we have here right now, but I think that we ought to stop bringing domesticated animals into existence altogether.
There's a problem with pets. If you have a pet, the pet is a carnivore. You may be a vegan. Does that mean you have to turn your pet into a vegan too?
Well, our dogs are all vegans and have been for decades, and they do very well. The question I get, as much as I get what about plants, the what about plants question, is what do you do about vegan cats? I draw the distinction between justification and excuse. Domestication throws up a lot of ugly dilemmas for us. I don't think that feeding meat to cats is morally justifiable. I think it's excusable. It's not morally an all right thing to do, but I understand, what else are you going to do? You know, I'm often asked, well, what if you're on a desert island and there are no vegetables and the only thing that you can do is eat a rabbit or die? And the answer is, well, look, if you and I are on the desert island, there are no vegetables to eat and there's no rabbits to eat, then I might kill you and consume you. That doesn't mean it's morally justifiable, but we might say it's excusable in the sense that it's a wrong thing you did, but we understand why you did it. I mean, if I had cats that needed meat, I would basically take the position, I'm not happy about doing this, I don't like doing this, but this is a situation in which I have to do something morally wrong in order to do the right thing.
Earlier you were talking about how some people inconsistently, in your view, eat free-range meat and it somehow salves their consciences. Well, what about turning this around on you? Eating a vegan diet typically involves suffering to animals. You may not see it, but I've worked in a flour mill. To store grain involves killing rats, killing mice. There's no easy way around that. So it's not as if you don't have blood on your hands either.
Well, look, my friends in the Jain community would say that basically you can't live in the material world without engaging in conduct that is harmful to other beings. And I agree with that. You can't. If I build a road, I know that there are going to be deaths on that road. There's still a difference between building a road where I know that people are going to get killed and actually killing particular people. And so if I say, look, I don't want to engage in violence, I don't want to engage in killing, so I'm not going to eat animals and I'm going to eat plants, well, obviously I should endeavor to farm in ways in which there is as little harm as possible. But will there be unintended harm? And the answer is yes, there will be.
If you came across a deer that had been killed on a road, would you be prepared to eat it? The deer's dead. It wasn't deliberately killed. It was an accident. If you don't eat it, the flesh goes to waste, a potential protein there. Is there anything wrong with eating it?
No, I wouldn't eat the deer any more than I would eat hamburgers that I found thrown away in a dumpster or something like that. I want to get us away from the idea of animals as things to eat. Just as if I went through the dumpster and I found a nice warm human arm, I wouldn't eat that because humans are not things to eat.
Why do you think so few people actually believe what you believe? I mean, there are many people who are concerned about animal suffering. Some of those stop eating red meat, some of them stop eating all meat and all fish. Very few take the whole journey towards veganism. Why do you think that is?
There are several reasons for that. I think the most important reason is there is a whole movement out there, a huge multi-billion-dollar industry movement called the humane movement or the animal movement or the animal rights movement or whatever you want to call it, that is telling people they don't need to do that. I mean, it's very, very hard for them to take the position that we ought to support free-range eggs and then say people shouldn't eat free-range eggs. So they don't have a vegan message. What they're doing is they're promoting this compassionate consumption. I hate that expression more than just about any expression in the globe, compassionate consumption. They've got the father of the animal rights movement, Peter Singer, saying death is not a harm. If we use animals in a humane way and we minimize their suffering, etc., there's nothing wrong with what we're doing. Well, if the father of the animal rights movement says that, then why should you think about veganism? But I'm here to tell you, if you care about animals, really, I mean, I really believe this. You don't eat them, wear them, or use them.
Gary Francione, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
There's now a Philosophy Bites book published by Oxford University Press. For more information, go to www.philosophybites.com.
For more information about the Institute, go to www.philosophy.sas.ac.uk.